historical Native American accounts of Sasquatch abducting their young ladies to use as mates. Hear all about it plus more coming up next. Alright, welcome to WILLSTAR Monsters and Mysteries. We have a good one today, ladies and gentlemen. We're going way back. We're going to the Pacific Northwest. As you see by the title and the thumbnail, I have a couple of accounts where Sasquatch is abducting Native American women, taking them away and using them as mates. Babies are born. Plus, I have a J.W. Burns story from 1936 of a native medicine man who has an encounter with a Sasquatch. The medicine man puts his powers up to the test. Wait until you hear what happens. And as a bonus, if you stay around to the end, I have a bonus article that a viewer has sent in to me. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome. What I do here on my channel is I give you these encounters and I do my best to show you the locations of these incidents using Google Earth. Alright, enough about that, let's do this. The Hairy Giants of Laidlaw. Laidlaw is a small station on the Canadian National Railroad. Close to it is an Indian reserve. There are many such small reserves along the Fraser River, but this one had the doubtful honor not long ago of playing unwilling host to a fearsome hairy giant. Indian lore has it that a mysterious race of giants, known as the Sasquatch, lived in the high mountains around Harrison Lake. Over the years, various Indians have reported brief encounters with these individuals. Such stories are not easily discounted, for the Indians have a remarkable memory for detail and find little purpose in distorting the facts as they know them. Various people in close contact with the Indians have no doubts that at least the remnants of such a race do exist in the hidden vastness of the coast mountains. One or two expeditions have even attempted to investigate, but were forced back by extremely rough and hostile terrain. The following instances are only two of the many stories told by the Indians. They were related in all seriousness by an Indian woman living near Laidlaw. Over 100 years ago, when the Indians were berry picking, one woman who had strayed from the others was suddenly confronted by a giant. Too paralyzed with fear to scream or run, she was quickly carried up the steep mountainside. After a long climb during which time she remained in a semi-coma and so did not note direction or length of time, she was carried through a rough opening into a large rock cave. Two other Indian women were crouched in the cave and when left alone with the new arrival, told her they had been captured in a similar manner years ago. They had been brought as wives for the giants and had since borne children. The males would disappear for months at a time and then return with food. For the new woman, they brought flour and smoked fish that they knew she was accustomed to eating. Side note, the fact that there was flour dates the story as taking place after the arrival of the Hudson's Bay traders 1827 to 1840. Although the woman had been captive for over a year and had borne a child, she was determined to escape. The two other women told her they would help, and when the hairy giants left on one of their seasonal hunting trips, she was told to prepare all the food she could. She made bread or bannock, side note suggesting that these people, or the Indian women at least, used fire, and with a heavy pack of food set out across the mountains. After almost endurable hardships, she became exhausted and was carried and helped along by the other two women who possessed the giant strength in some measure. She was left in a stupor near where she had originally disappeared. The villagers saw her, but she suddenly became afraid of them and fled. She was pursued and carried to her father's house where she fainted and remained under a spell. The Indians believed that the giants held some mental power over her, but with careful nursing she eventually recovered. The second episode is still fresh in many of the Indians' memories. Several years ago, in the vicinity of Laidlaw, a hairy giant entered a house and caused a woman and her two children to flee in terror. Later, footprints approximately 20 inches long were found, clearly imprinted in the mud along the route the woman had taken. Although she was not captured, she has since refused to live in the house. Hair caught in the door jamb was reported reddish in color. A 40-gallon barrel of salted fish had been picked up and dumped over, and the retreating footprints showed that the Sasquatch had merely stepped over the railroad fences and returned directly to the steep mountain slopes. Alright, so here's another account of Sasquatch abducting a Native American young lady. The STENWYKEN, the wild man of the woods, Okanagan Valley, British Columbia. One Indian legend of the Okanagan Valley concerns the hairy giant that they call STENWYKEN. This beast sounds like the one whom Indians in other parts of British Columbia call the Sasquatch, and who may have inspired the Coast Indians' ceremonial mask of the wild man of the woods. Hester White, writing in the 1962 report of the Okanagan Historical Society, said a Christmas visitor had told her about the STENWYKEN while she was living in Penticton. Her guest was an Indian called Suswap, who had worked for her father, Judge Haynes, at Osoyoos. Said Suswap, STENWYKEN, the hairy giant who smelled of burning hair, left tracks near the Indian caches where he helped himself to the dried meat, fish, roots, and berries stored for the winter. He was often seen at the mouths of creeks catching fish. He was a peaceful man and never harmed the Indians. However, one day in the long ago, at berry time, an Indian maiden disappeared. It was feared that STENWYKEN had carried her away. After a long time, she returned to her tribe and said STENWYKEN had seized her and carried her to a large cave, the floor of which was covered with skins of bear, deer, and mountain sheep. She was given roots, berries, dried fish, and meat to eat. She was not harmed in any way, but she was prisoner because of a large stone rolled across the mouth of the cave, preventing her from going out again. When she was left alone, she used some of the hides to make a pair of moccasins in the hopes that she would have a chance to escape one day or night. The rising moon showed her that the stone was not as tightly over the entrance to the cave as it had been, and she was able to squeeze past the stone to liberty. And after traveling many miles, she at length found her own people. Another Indian girl belonging to the North Okanagan Indian tribe vanished from their camp some years later. After 3 years, she came back and said STENWYKEN had captured her and carried her off to a large cave. He had sealed her eyelids with pine pitch so that she could not see where they were going. Sometime afterwards, she gave birth to a STENWYKEN baby, but it died. Again, her eyes were sealed with pitch, and she was returned to a place near her people's camp, where the pitch was removed. She was released, but the STENWYKEN watched from a hiding place until she arrived safely in the camp. In spite of all of STENWYKEN's precautions, people thought that they knew where the cave in question was, at Tulameen, Allison, Princeton, not far from the Okanagan Valley. Miners on their way to Fraser River goldfields sheltered in it, and A.E. Howes, a pioneer Princeton merchant, stored his extra supplies there. Hester White related that a Japanese miner camped at the north end of Okanagan Valley was awakened one night when something heavily brushed against his tent. Thinking that it was the mine boss, he went outside, and there stood STENWYKEN with his hands out. The Japanese man gave the creature some food, and STENWYKEN left. STENWYKEN used the same begging method again near Lumbee, southeast of Vernon. Again, he was given food, and again he left peacefully. No doubt, the Sasquatch of Harrison Lake and the STENWYKEN of Okanagan Valley are one and the same. As he has done no harm, he deserves consideration and his freedom to roam at will, added Hester White. While traveling to West Bank via Dog Lake, Miss John Fall Allison was told about the big men who live in these mountains by her Indian guides. Her granddaughter, Miss Jim Sisson of North Vancouver, told me that when Miss Allison wrote about the Sui Epo, she really meant the Sasquatch. Miss Allison said that it was a species sometimes malevolent and sometimes benevolent, and a monster, something like a huge ape, and was said to live both on Chapaco and Mount Baker. All right, now I got a story from J.W. Burns from 1936. It was reprinted in Ivan Sanderson's book, The Abdominal Snowman. A well-known old Amerindian medicine man named Frank Dan told an interesting story. This occurred in July 1936 along Morris Creek, a small tributary of the Harrison River. J.W. Burns writes of Frank's story. It was a lovely day. The clear waters of the creek shimmered in the bright sunshine and reflected the wild surroundings of cliffs, trees, and vagrant cloud. A languid breeze wafted across the rocky gullies. Frank's canoe was gliding like a happy vision along the mountain stream. The Indian was busy hooking one fish after another, hungry fish that had been liberated only a few days before from some hatchery. But the Indian was happy as he pulled them in and sang his medicine song. Then, without a warning, a rock was hurled from the shelving slope above, falling with a fearful splash within a few feet of his canoe. Startled out of his skin, Frank glanced upward and to his amazement beheld a weird-looking creature leaping from rock to rock down the wild declivity with the agility of a mountain goat. Frank recognized the hairy creature instantly. It was a Sasquatch. He knew it was one of the giants. He had met them on several occasions in past years, once on his own doorstep. But those were a timid sort and not unruly like the gent he was now facing. Frank called upon his medicine powers, Sula, and similar spirits to protect him. There was an immediate response to his appeal. The air throbbed and some huge boulders slid down the rocky mountain slide, making a noise like the crack of doom. This was to frighten away the Sasquatch. But the giant was not to be frightened by falling rocks. Instead, he hurried down the declivity carrying a great stone under his great arm, which Frank guessed, just a rough guess, was at least 2 yards in length. Reaching a point of vantage, a jutting ledge that hung far out over the water, he hurled it with all his might, this time missing the canoe by a narrow margin, filling it with water and drenching the poor frightened occupant with a cloud of spray. Some idea of the size of the boulder may be gained from the fact that its huge bulk blocked the channel. Later, Jack Penny dredged it out on the authority of the Department of Hinterland Navigation. It may now be seen on the 10th floor of the Vancouver Public Museum in the Department of Curious Rocks. When you're in Vancouver, drop into the museum and the curator will gladly show it to you. The giant now posed upon the other ledge in an attitude of wild majesty, as if he were the monarch of those foreboding haunts, shaking a colossal fist at the great medicine man, who sat awestruck and shuddering in the canoe, trying to bail out with his shoe. The Indian saw the Sasquatch was in a towering rage, a passion that caused the creature to exude a repugnant odor, and that was carried down to the canoe by a wisp of wind. The smell made Frank dizzy, and his eyes began to smart and pop. Frank never smelled anything in his whole medicine career like it. It was more repelling than the stench of moccasin oil gone rotten. Indeed, it was so nasty that the fish left the pools and nooks and headed in schools for the Harrison River. The Indian, believing that the giant was about to dive into the water and attack him, cast off his fishing lines and paddled away as fast as he was able. Frank Dan was an old and respected medicine man living by the precepts and beliefs of his ancestors. Thus, his interpretation of events had to be in accord with his position in the community. It is a straightforward account, namely, that while fishing, a Sasquatch appeared, hurled some rocks at an old man, and stank like hell. The induced landslide and the weight of the second rock hurled, or perhaps merely dislodged into the river, as well as the giant's implied curse, are pure embellishments. Even the max exodus of the trout might well be perfectly true and due to a cascade of boulders, rather than to a stink in the air that they could of course not smell in the water. Besides, Frank Dan's medicine came off second best, and he had manifestly fled. He couldn't explain this fact away, so he just did the best he could not to show up in too poor of a light. In fact, Mr. Burns records that Frank Dan gave up being a medicine man from then on, saying that his powers had been finally defeated. That would seem to be the act of an honest man. Alright, now for everybody that has stuck around to the end of the video, I have a bonus article for you. After watching my last video, I had a viewer email me with another encounter from the San Diego area. Now this is an article from the 1990s having to do with incidents that occurred in the 1880s. So let's go ahead and get into it. A horrible tale from the pages of local history. The Monster of Dead Man's Hole, San Diego County, California. Mysterious ethnic monsters are all the rage today. Best known is the abominable snowman of Tibet. Then there's the Yowie of Australia, Bigfoot of California, the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest, Nessie of Loch Ness, Scotland, and the Wildman of Hubei, China. Yet, San Diego was not left behind the door when the monsters were passed out. Long before the San Diego Zoobies were sighted and recorded, there was the monster of Dead Man's Hole. Just about as nasty as they come, it was reported long before the monsters come lately mentioned above. Dead Man's Hole is located near Oak Grove, a former stage stop of the Butterfield Line. It is located about 10 miles northwest of Warner Hot Springs. The story of the horrid events leading up to the discovery of the monster was told many years ago by James Jasper, editor and owner of the Julian Sentinel, Julian, California. Julian is now a thriving little artist community renowned for its homegrown apple pies, and Warner Hot Springs is a hot spa for the wealthy in the backcountry of San Diego County. When the Butterfield stage line was established, it ran by the then nameless Dead Man's Hole, then filled with clear, sparkling water. Often a stop was made to refresh men and horses before resuming the trip. Behind the hole, a canyon slices back into the steep hills, growing darker and darker and narrower as it winds back into the still wild and roadless escarpment frowning over a pleasant valley below. As it gets deep into the mountains, the canyon walls are so steep and the trees are so thick and somber that sunlight only penetrates to the bottom for an hour or so at noon. One bright morning in the spring of 1858, the northbound stage stopped at the hole, and the driver got out for a drink. As he leaned over the pool, he saw to his horror the partly decomposed face of a dead man bobbing gently in the water. This was the first known victim of Dead Man's Hole. As time went by, news was received in San Diego that several men, both Indian and white, had disappeared without a trace. But since people were always running away from their families or going off to seek gold, not much notice was paid to these reports. In 1870, an unnamed French sheepherder was found dead at the hole by his squaw. In 1876, a passenger lighting from the stage for a drink said he had seen a naked thing covered with long black hair staring at him from nearby bushes. When the creature saw he was discovered, he vanished into the canyon. A few years later, a man named William Blair was found strangled in the dark woods near the hole. He had influential and wealthy friends in San Francisco, and they came down to the area determined to find his murderer, but no clues were found. Later that year, the strangled body of an Indian girl was found not 200 feet from where Blair's body had been discovered. So in March 1888, two hunters, Edward Dean, Charles Cox of Julian, determined to explore the dark and mysterious canyon behind Dead Man's Hole. After a hard struggle, they managed to get about a mile up the canyon through a tangle of fallen logs, boulders, and underbrush. As they paused for breath, they heard a crashing nearby. Cox climbed up the rocky side of the canyon to see what was making the noise. He almost fell off in astonishment. An immense, unwieldy animal resembling a bear from the back was taking rapid strides through the narrow defile away from the hunters. Cox said its legs were long and the creature looked something like a gorilla. Its hair was dark brown and the beast was more than 6 feet high. Cox climbed down and whispered the news to Dean. Both began to follow the thing. Cox, to stop its progress, fired a shot in the air. At the shot, the beast turned its face towards its pursuers. The face was human-like. Then the creature started climbing the canyon wall towards the cave opening. Cox fired, and with a terrible cry, the monster fell to the canyon floor dead. Cautiously approaching the body, the men later reported the face was Indian, but the teeth were like bear's fangs with pointed ends. The creature's feet were huge and covered with black hair. Fearing they would meet the monster's mate, they climbed gingerly up to the cave's mouth, then entered. It was empty, but in one corner, 8 human skulls grinned from a rock ledge, while a half-consumed sheep carcass lay on the floor. In a corner, a pile of leaves and weeds indicated the creature's bed. In a report given in a San Diego newspaper of the 1888 era, Jasper said the monster's body had been placed in a wagon and taken to San Diego, where it was to have gone on expedition the next day.